Welcome to I Love Apes. If you're taking an environmental science class and you need help, you've come to the right place. My name is Eric Sampson, and I'm here to help you. Today we're going to be looking at keystone species and trophic cascades. Let's take a look at this. So, what is a keystone species? A keystone species is basically one that has a really large impact on the number and distribution of the different species in an ecosystem. They're like the glue that holds the ecosystem together. So a best way to think of it, I think, is this. If you remove a keystone species from the ecosystem, it makes the ecosystem look different. It's not the same ecosystem at all. It causes such huge changes. So here's a classic example that is pointed to here. So this is a kelp forest. A kelp forest is an amazingly biodiverse cold water ecosystem that happens off the coast of places like California and South Africa. So a keystone species is one that if you remove it, it completely transforms the ecosystem. So what's the keystone species here? Well, the keystone species here is the sea otter. And why is the sea otter a keystone species? Because sea otters, they live at the surface, they're males, they swim down here and they eat sea urchins. Okay, but what happens is when people hunted all the sea otters away from places off the islands of Alaska, they didn't go down and eat these sea urchins. Well, guess what sea urchins eat? They eat kelp, and so all the biodiversity was dependent on this kelp forest. All gone. All you have is what they call an urchin barren. You can see the little kelp try to grow, and they just eat them right away. So this one species, who would have guessed? This one cute little adorable species that we all love. It held the whole thing together. It was the glue that held the ecosystem together. So here's what it looks like with otters present. Here's what it looks like with it absent. Now, keystone species play different roles. They can do different things to be a keystone species. So you can be a predator, you can be a prey, an engineer, or a mutualist. You could expand this, but this will do. Okay, so let's just start off by talking about predators as keystone species. So the reason predators are, usually we're talking about the apex predators. The apex predator basically holds down the population of the things below it, and as a result, this changes the number and behaviors of their herbivores. They're more skittish, there's not as many of them, and as a result, it gives plants more chance to grow and produce NPP, which is just better for the biodiversity of the ecosystem. So we're talking about things like lions, wolves, great white sharks, which everybody thinks are so cool. Who knows? Maybe this sea lion will get away and won't get eaten. I'll leave it up to you. Now, surprisingly, sometimes prey items are considered to be a keystone species, but not always. So they're considered to be a keystone species in this case if they occur in such large numbers like balls of herring or herds of wildebeest in the plains of Africa. The idea is their population is so large that they, maintain control over the amount of growth in the productivity in the area, and there just are this reservoir of food for so many species in the area. So non-keystone prey items, if they get eaten or they go away, it doesn't really change the ecosystem. But you take these away or these away, and their ecosystems are deeply impacted. Then we have, I think these ones are cool, the engineers. And these ones are a little bit hard to understand unless you study them. Okay, so basically an engineer is a keystone species that builds something, either builds the way you think of building or just with its own body builds things or destroys things even. And in doing so, they maintain the ecosystem in its current structure. So let's just take a look at a few of these real quick. So beavers are well known for building beaver dams out of willow branches. Well, when they do this, they turn fast-running little tiny streams into these ponds, and that changes the whole ecosystem to look differently. It has a lot more biodiversity because they have all these different fish species, all the different kind of birds that will come in and use it. So you take these away, and all of a sudden you're back to a rushing river, and you've changed everything. Mangroves are super important. We'll talk about them a lot this year. In tropical wetland areas, you have these mangroves. They have these root buster systems, and they prevent the erosion of the coastline. You take these away, and your coastline erodes. Your all the fish species that you've been fishing are all gone now. So you take these away, and you completely alter the coastline and the entire look of the ecosystem in which these are found. Elephants, you may not realize this, but they have a tendency to pull down or eat little trees. And as a consequence, if you take elephants away, you go from having a grassland area with scattered trees like a savanna to having a forest. I happened to went to a place in Africa where that happened. They took all the elephants out of this one area, hunted them away actually, and it went from being a grassland back to being a forest. And then coral reefs, obviously super important. They obviously provide habitat for a lot of fish species just by growing. Their bodies engineer a hard substrate that allows a lot of things to live, but it also prevents a lot of the erosion of the shoreline as well, kind of in the way that mangroves do. And then you have mutualists. So mutualism we talked about in a previous video. So usually we're talking about either pollinators or seed dispersers. So these are things that a lot of the plants in the ecosystem rely on in order to reproduce and spread themselves around the ecosystem. So clearly bees are the bees and angiosperms, flowering plants, are completely dependent on each other. Most of the plants you see in, say, a tropical rainforest are flowering plants that rely on pollinators. Not always bees, it could be hummingbirds and other things, but they need a pollinator. You take the pollinator away, and now the trees can't reproduce, and what was a forest with all this biodiversity becomes something very, very different. And then you have these babies. I got to see these in Australia once. They're awesome. It's called a cassowary. They're like living dinosaurs. They're really violent birds. But they're beautiful and ugly at the same time. But basically, they eat a lot of the fruit that grows in these tropical rainforests in northern Australia, New Guinea, place like that. And they poop them out. And by doing that, they drop the seeds in other places. If you take these away, then the forest cannot continue to exist in the way it is. So that's what makes these things such important species that we call them keystone species. So let's move on to talk about the concept of a trophic cascade. This is a cool idea, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. So basically, it's this ecological phenomenon in which the removal of one often high-order consumer, but not necessarily, but let's just go with that. You take this one high-order consumer away, and the entire ecosystem changes. So obviously what we mean then is that one we took away was a keystone species, but let's just see how the removal of one causes a change, which causes a change, which causes a change. So, for instance, if you remove wolves from an ecosystem, the grazers increase, which causes a decrease in the plant species they graze on. This is exactly what happened in the American West. The ranchers didn't like wolves, they took away. And if you look at pictures that were taken before, and there weren't a lot of them because of when it happened, but before you remove the wolves, the West looked very different than it does now. It completely changed the ecosystem through this trophic cascade that we're going to walk ourselves through right now. So before, when the wolves are present, the wolves put pressure on the elk population. So the elk get eaten, the elk are skittish, they don't come out that often, and so that means they're not eating as much of the trees, and so the trees grow lush, and all the birds and mammals and things that live in here are doing well. But the ranchers go, we don't like wolves. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of these wolves so they don't eat my sheep. Yeah, well, that means they're also not eating the elk. So the elk population gets huge. That means it's going to eat all these plants, and all the birds and mammals and other things that lived in the forest are now gone. And so you completely change the look of the ecosystem by removing one thing. So taking one thing away causes a change in another population, which causes a change in another population, and you can keep going in many cases. So the concept of a keystone species was first developed in the 1960s when this one scientist, I think it was from the University of Santa Cruz in California, I'm pretty sure it was, decided to take this one kind of starfish, right, where I live in the state of Washington. They're beautiful starfish. They're purple and orange. They're called piasters. And he said, I wonder what happened if I just took them away. It's kind of cool they do. So he said, all right, I'm going to look at my typical ecosystem. I'm just going to intentionally from this one area remove all the starfish and just see what happens. And what happened was shocking. Biodiversity just plummeted. So take a look at this. This is what it looks like when they're present. This is kind of a grainy photo, but this is, when I go walking on the Olympic coastline, the tide goes out, the rocks look like this. You see a little bit of algae growing on it, and you see these piasters and a few other shellfish, whatever. But the biodiversity is actually very high. If you count the species, there's a lot of them. But what happened when he took them away is it ended up looking like this, mussels. And don't get me wrong, I love eating mussels, okay? But the thing is, when you took them away, the mussels just took over and didn't leave room for anything else. And although there's a lot of this one particular species, the biodiversity is very low. So you completely change the ecosystem by removing one particular species. That's how you came up with this idea of these things are keystone to maintaining this particular ecosystem structure. So this is the data he showed, which I think is kind of cool. So in his control, he left the piastres present, and when he counted the species, he came up with between, say, 17 and 20 species, over the course of this decade-long research. And that's the name of research. It can take a while, right? But good for him. But when he took them out, what happened was, very quickly, he went from having the same number of species, in the upper teens, to very few, and it just stayed that way throughout. All right, so you have to have these in order to have the ecosystem look the way it is. Now, a trophic cascade is something we're going to try to model using arrows. So the idea in a trophic cascade diagram is this. Unlike a food chain or food web where the arrows point in the direction that energy is moving, these point in the direction of interaction. So basically, this predator interacts with the herbivore, and the herbivore interacts with a producer. So it's basically showing which way a benefit or harm is being delivered, in a sense. Okay. So let's take three organisms that share an ecosystem in Yellowstone. We have elk, we have willow trees, and we have beavers. Okay. So a direct effect means the organisms directly interact with each other. Elk eat willow. That's a direct interaction, so we're going to use a solid line to represent it. Well, beavers interact with willow trees in order to get the material to build their dam. So this is direct interaction that takes place between willows and beaver. So we're going to draw it, but we're going to draw it from the willow down. It's because we're trying to trace the path, the cascading path of what happens if I take off something up in the chain on things farther down. All right, and so what we're going to do is that we're going to use a negative or a positive sign. So the negative sign basically means that the one that the arrow is pointing from, that if its population gets bigger, this one will get smaller. So we're going to use a negative to say that this a large population here is going to be bad for this one. More of these means less of these, and we're going to use a plus sign for the opposite. More of these means more of these. These are good for these, whereas these are bad for these. So we use a plus sign to mean that more of this gives you more of this. Well, now we get to something that's really interesting, and that is the indirect effects. So the indirect effects happens when the change in one population has an impact on the population of another organism with which it does not directly interact. So wolves and willow trees, they don't interact with each other. Like wolves don't eat them. They have nothing to do with each other directly, but they do indirectly. So let's see how we're going to do this. We're going to say, all right, look, so wolves eat elk. So more wolves mean less elk. Well, elk eat willows. So more elk means less willows. So there's two negative interactions here. But what we're going to do is we're going to draw a dash line like this. And it just turns out that if the population of wolves goes up, the population of willows goes up. So we're going to put a plus there, saying that this indirect effect is positive. More of these gives you more of these. Let's take a look at why that would be. So here's our wolf, elk, and willow, okay? Just what I had before. Now let's think about this. If there's more wolves, there's less elk. And if there's less elk, that means there's going to be more willows. Because if more of these means less of these, then less of these means more of these. So what that means then is, since more wolves means more willows, we're going to give it a positive. Let's look at another one. Well, now we got elk, willow, and beaver. So elk eat willow, so that's a negative. Okay, and willows, if I have less willows, I'm going to have less beavers, right? It's a positive interaction. What that means is more of these means less of these, but since this is a positive, less of these means less of these. So therefore, what that means is if I have more elk, I will have less beaver. That is a negative interaction, but it's indirect. So now let's take a look at this one, okay? Back to the sea otters, okay? So sea otters have a negative direct effect on urchins. They eat them. So more otters, less urchins. Less urchins means there's more kelp, since urchins eat kelp, and that's why having otters are important, because more otters means there's more kelp. But if there's more kelp, there's more sheephead fish. So even though sea otters don't directly interact with sheephead fish, the presence of sea otters, the more of these we have, the more of these we have, so the indirect effect is therefore a positive one. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in our next unit, Unit 2 on biodiversity. Hey, thanks for watching. Listen, if you found this video to be useful at all, I would appreciate if you go ahead and give it a like. If there's something you want to tell me, some kind of feedback or some video you'd like me to make, go ahead and put that in the comment section for me. Be sure to check the description below. I often post the PDF of the document that I use, also practice problems and so on that can help you do better on your AP test. And of course, you know what's coming. More than anything else, what I really need you to do is hit that subscribe button.